We've got a amazing guest joining us, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has covered, you name it, the Stasi, the Russians, and many tyrannies. He's been in high-level coverage of negotiations all over the Middle East, and he sued earlier this year over the NDAA that Obama signed on December 31st when he thought no one was paying attention, 2011. He has a new book just out, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. We're going to talk about that. We've only got him till the bottom of the hour. He's, again, gracious to join us, a very busy man. And I want to talk about his NDAA suit that's having some success. I want to get his take on everything that's unfolding. But now we have activists put on terror watch lists preventing protesting DNC. Turned out the Army, the ACLU, here's the ACLU press release just out yesterday on it. They got the document where the Army, DOD, did it. And they say in here that it's low-level terrorism to protest and ask the court to keep him in jail because protesting is now illegal. We are seeing, again, the FBI caught with 12 million IDs of folks with Apple computers. Here, joining us to break it down is Chris Hedges, who I don't really need to go over more of his bio here. Most people know who he is or should know who he is, but he joins us now. Chris, what is the state of the world in your view?
Well, I think, one of the things we have to be clear about is that the assault on civil liberties, which began under the Bush administration, has in fact been accelerated by the Obama administration. It's worse under Obama than under Bush. When you tick off all of the things that the Obama administration has done over the last 4 years, refusal to restore habeas corpus, interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act has given the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens, whatever you think of these figures, like Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni cleric, and then, of course, his 16-year-old son, who was never accused of anything 2 weeks later. The FISA Amendment Act, which I'm one of the plaintiffs, but will be heard in the Supreme Court on October 29th, which retroactively made legal what under our Constitution has always been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens who have done nothing, been charged with no crime, and we know that all of our personal information is now being stored out in supercomputers in Utah. The Obama administration has also employed 6 times the Espionage Act, which was never designed to ferret out whistleblowers as they are using it. These are people who have exposed war crimes. In the case of the CIA official Sterling, who purportedly leaked this information to Jim Risen at the New York Times, he's used it to essentially shut down anything that counters the official government narrative. And I was an investigative reporter for the New York Times. I know many of the major investigative reporters, and they will tell you that at this point, investigating anything the government does has become impossible. Even on background briefings will no longer be given because people are scared of being charged with the Espionage Act, as 6 officials have been charged, which, of course, brings with it prison time. And this brings us to the National Defense Authorization Act, which, as you mentioned, Alex, was signed by the president on December 31st, New Year's Eve, of course, a moment when he thought we weren't looking. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, authorizes the U.S. government, or more specifically the executive branch, to condemn or label an American citizen a terrorist, and not only a terrorist, but in the language of that section, someone who has relationships with what they call associated forces, a term that's never defined. To use the military, this is contravening 200 years of domestic law, to detain these people, hold them in military facilities, strip them of due process, and if the military so determines, actually ship them to offshore penal colonies like Guantanamo and other black sites around the world in the language of this section until the end of hostilities, whenever that is. In an age of permanent war, that's a very long time. We challenged that in the Southern District Court of New York. Federal Judge Catherine Forrest issued a temporary injunction, in essence invalidating that section of the NDAA. We had a final hearing the beginning of August, and in which Judge Forrest will now determine whether that temporary injunction will become permanent. But we know how the Obama administration will respond if she invalidates that section of the NDAA, which of course I think she should. They've already challenged the temporary injunction. They will clearly challenge the permanent injunction if she rules that it is unconstitutional, as it appears she will. That will take it to an appellate court. If they uphold the ruling, it will go to the Supreme Court. But all of this comes under the Obama administration. And my frustration with self-professed liberals is that, they're entranced with the rhetoric of Obama and utterly ignore the facts, utterly ignore what he has done. And as you mentioned earlier, I think what we are seeing is, in essence, a rewriting of the legal code to criminalize any form of legitimate dissent. And that's because the corporate state, corporate power understands very well what's coming, both in terms of the environmental crisis and the economic crisis, and they want the legal mechanisms to shut it down. It's interesting that in the August, in the last hearing in Judge Forrest's courtroom, she, as the judge, actually brought up the detention of 110,000 Japanese Americans who, because of their ethnicity, were sent to internment camps, again, without any kind of legal recourse, and said that this section of the NDA essentially sets that precedent.
We are now reaching the Alexander Solzhenitsyn type moment, asking, will we burn later in the camps, wishing we'd done something? And now, 3 months ago, the Army document came out for re-education centers. The Army admitted in a press release that our document was real, but that we shouldn't have it. And another public document for gun confiscation during crises. They're buying armored vehicles. They've bought 1.4 billion rounds of ammo. The media spins it to say, hey, they need 174,000 rounds of ammo. No, it's 1.4 billion. So we're seeing all sorts of propaganda. Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist who's covered police states worldwide, Chris Hedges, joins us. We're going to talk about his book here in a moment. We're going to skip this network break so we have more time with him. What is the ruling class thinking? Because we've always had different corrupt elites and things, but there was still an understanding, even for the ultra-wealthy and powerful, that you want checks and balances going back to Magna Carta, because other elites can come in and rob you, and that nobody wants to live in a society that's not free. I mean, free societies are more productive, they're happier, they're better. What has happened to the ruling class that they're going, I mean, the Stalin, Mao, Hitler route? I mean, this is, earlier in the shorter segment, I'd like you to recap that. You pointed out you've covered a lot of historical events that happened as they happened. This is one of the nastiest, most scientifically crafted, over the top. I mean, so many things that are in 1984 have now been surpassed, and now they're getting ready for the physical roundups. I don't think people understand, who haven't looked at history like you and others have, just how dark it is my point.
Yeah, I mean, in the language of patriotism, these people are traitors. And that's the difference, as you point out, between the older ruling elite, and I come out of the working class. They were certainly no friends to working men and women, frankly. But they cared about the sustenance of the nation. The new ruling elite is global. It, in the language of business, is quite willing to harvest the nation. That's how you've seen manufacturing jobs shipped overseas. And you look at labor conditions in southern China, where Apple products, all sorts of products that we buy are made, and it's out of Dickinsonian England. 70-hour work weeks, abusive conditions, no labor protection. And what they tell now workers around the world is that in order to be competitive, they have to be competitive, in essence, with prison labor in China or sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour.
Exactly. We're Foxconn that Apple uses, while we're being lectured by Al Gore here domestically, they have to put suicide nets up.
Yeah, what happens is when they don't meet their quotas, and there's a good book by a Berkeley sociologist who's of Chinese origin who went and wrote about it, wrote about these conditions. When they don't meet their quotas and they don't make the profits there are workers who will work and actually not be paid. And at the end of the month, they will climb up to the roofs of these overcrowded dormitories and jump off and commit suicide. And that's the world that these corporations have created. I mean, and that's the difference between the old robber barons, the Rockefellers, the Mellons, the Carnegies, and the new robber barons who are quite willing to sacrifice the nation, indeed are, for profit. When they do their speculative gambling on Wall Street and their bubbles crash, they loot the U.S. Treasury, and then they make the rest of us pay for it through austerity programs. You see the same thing in Europe because, of course, it's a global corporate movement, so that when Papandreou in Greece announces, okay, you want austerity, I'm going to put it to a referendum, he's gone within a week. And he's replaced with a banker technocrat that's, that is essentially pliable and a puppet of the banks and of the corporate interests. This is a global phenomena. We're not exempt from it. And these essentially narrow oligarchic corporate forces, then we see it. They make all their money here, and then they move overseas so they don't have to pay any taxes.
Well, they're moving to armored redoubts on Pacific Islands and admitting they are, and they're bragging that they're converting us to a tyranny and training the police that we're their enemy. I mean, this is a nightmare scenario. And the attitude is, Americans are uppity. We're going to bring you down. We're going to cut you down to size, while lecturing people who are on welfare because they've destroyed the jobs base, while they are the biggest recipients of corporate welfare contracts, bailouts. And then in Europe, I've looked at the numbers, almost all of the real debt is owed by the big zombie banks, and they've done this trick of convincing everyone that the Europeans are lazy, and now today they're reporting that they want Greeks to work 6-day work weeks, and then most of the money is to be paid to the bankers that Greece is having to hand their islands over to.
Yeah, well, that's precisely it. And, that they will, corporations know only one word, and that's more. And they are going to push and push and push, like all sort of elites that have unplugged themselves from the reality around them. They're woefully out of touch with what most Americans are undergoing. And it is always the ruling elites that finally determine the parameters and configurations of revolt and rebellion. Because they have not responded rationally, as the columnist Paul Krugman writes week after week, to both the economic and political crisis, it means that there will be a backlash. What exactly it will look like, how it will appear, when it will appear, I don't know. I've covered revolutions in Eastern Europe, uprisings in Palestine, the war in Yugoslavia. But I do know, especially having spent the last 2 years on this book, in the poorest pockets of the United States, without any question, that is coming.
And the establishment knows that and is making preparations for it, I think, to use that crisis as a pretext to grab even more power. If you expand on this out into the future, what type of world do you think the ultra-rich, who are obviously monopoly capitalists, what type of world are they planning on building?
In essence, a kind of feudal system where you have a tiny, filthy rich oligarchic elite, a small sort of core of corporate managers, public relations people, in essence propagandists, and then the rest of us hanging on by our fingertips. And, interestingly enough, this completely replicates the political and economic structure that Orwell painted in 1984 with Oceania, where you had an inner party of 2 to 4%, an outer party of about 12%, and the rest are what he calls proles. That's already, all you have to do is look out your window at a decaying infrastructure, closing schools, closing fire departments, closing libraries, long-term unemployment and underemployment, coupled with this kind of constant sustenance of criminal enterprise. Look at Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is bailed out every penny on the dollar by the American taxpayer, and now we give them, in essence, 0% interest loans so that they can gamble. I don't know what it is. It's not capitalism. I don't even know what to call it.
And then to loan it back to us at 10, 20, 30 or more percent.
Well, and they often don't loan. Talk to any small businessman. They can't get loans. I mean,
and why should the banks loan? They've got all the money they could ever want, taxpayer-backed money. Expanding on this, I went and saw Dinesh D'Souza's film, the 2016 Obama's America, and they were saying that Obama was anti-colonialist when really I see this as a new colonialism where it's these mega banks and mega elites that are destroying the nation states that were the old cores of the empire, not just exploiting the third world. They've brought the cancer home, but then they spin it that Obama is an anti-colonialist, and so that's why he's doing what he's doing. I mean, it's an amazing spin.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And, we actually call the places that, places like Camden internal colonies because it is a form of colonialism. And, just to go back to your point earlier about the militarization of police, I think when you look at the war on, so-called war on drugs, you see the portal, the way they entered it, so that if there's a night raid now in Oakland, you have Kevlar-plated command helicopters, command centers, people dressed in black, carrying M16s. It looks no different from a night raid in Fallujah. And that's the point, that as the disintegration continues, the more brutal forms of control that are used on the outer reaches of empire migrate back to the heart of empire.
And the megacorporations then plan to even implode the old homelands and then just have a giant squalor that they rule over from private, heavily armed redoubts and cities. And that's now even their admitted plan, the Rand Corporation is saying. What a hellish vision. What a hellish world. It sounds like something the devil would come up with.
Yeah, and you have corporations like Bechtel buying up all the clean water in Chile and other places because they know that pretty soon water, water for most of us will be contaminated and we'll have to pay for it, just like everything else. Yeah, I mean, they if you sit down inside the NSA or any other, their sort of analysis of where we're going is not going to be much different from yours or mine. It just doesn't make it out into the mainstream.
Well, that's right. They've got British Ministry of Defense reports, Pentagon reports admitting a hellish world. And then if I cover it, the media calls it pessimism porn. Won't this be the defining moment when your case goes to the Supreme Court if they don't uphold the Constitution? I mean, this will be overthrowing Magna Carta, habeas corpus. I mean, this is probably one of the biggest cases ever. What is it like to be at the center of this?
Well, it's sort of bizarre in a sense because I agree with you. I mean, it is, and the judge agrees with us, that this is just this amazing attempt to essentially strip us of the rule of law, of due process, and yet it doesn't get covered. It doesn't get covered because both the Republicans and the Democrats are essentially beholden to corporate power and the security and surveillance state. I mean, this was a bipartisan effort, sponsored by Carl Levin and John McCain. And so because the media won't step outside these very narrow parameters, which essentially stretch from A to B, that's what stunned me the most, how egregious the assault is, how naked the assault is, and how it's virtually uncovered. I mean, the New York Times did write a good editorial about it after the temporary injunction was issued, but, if you look on the airwaves, it doesn't exist. And yet you have all these people sort of shouting about the Constitution and civil liberties, and here in an incredibly overt attempt to take away, our right to trial, silence.
And now I see a lot of conservatives going along with this when the government's now said, don't worry about al-Qaeda, and we're going to use them and others to take down Syria and Libya and places. But, the new enemy is domestic threats, and they're out, like they've done with Muslims, provocateuring, militia groups in Michigan and things, trying to get some type of civil war going so they can now target the American people as the enemy. This is very cold-blooded.
I don't think it is a left-right issue. The American conservative just ran a long article called In Defense of Bradley Manning, raising precisely these points. And that's why I think that, the political theater of the Republicans and the Democrats, is really a kind of a mass, money-drenched spectacle that diverts us from debating issues that I don't think, really, for anybody who cares about the rule of law and the democratic state, no matter what your political opinion is, there should be any divide on it all.
Well, that's right. We're all Americans. We're all humans. And if America becomes this pure tyranny, boy, the world better look out. If they think we've been doing bad stuff so far, Chris, look out. I know you've got to go. I'll talk to you briefly during the break if you can stay 5 more. I want to come back and talk about the book, but if not, folks.
No, sure. Let's do it.
Okay, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. I have not read it yet. I will read it because, let me tell you, when I see Chris Hedges' videos online, he's focused. He knows what he's talking about. He's articulate. I get mad and just yell and scream. I wish I was like him. But then I'm just a constitutionalist. I want my Bill of Rights. I want my Constitution. If that's liberal, if that's conservative, then that's what I am. But I just love Chris Hedges, and he's so good to come on and talk about this with us. We've got about 6-7 minutes left with Mr. Hedges holding over with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, journalist who's covered some of the most dangerous places in the world, and he's saying that, well, what he sees here in America, I want him to expand on that, is the worst he's ever seen so far. I want him to elaborate on that because it's intriguing. If I went over his bio here for folks that may not know who Chris Hedges is, he's been in over 50 countries. He's covered the big battle zones. He's covered world leaders. He's covered the Stasi and their activities. Just amazing. And he's got a new book out that we're going to be obviously breaking down as soon as I get a chance to read it. Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. But I wanted him to go over basically what the book covers, because earlier he started mentioning that it's a reservation program, and I've interviewed a lot of Native Americans who've gone over the history, and they point out that Indian policy became what Hitler used, and I'd actually read that in Hitler's own writings, that he used that model of the concentration camp off the reservation. The company store that keeps control of the people, keeps them in poverty, their life expectancy, and that's the whole model now of this corporate state. Get rid of your jobs and then give you a pittance to barely even keep you at subsistence, destroying destinies, destroying societies, so you can control them. And now the corporate state doesn't want even free market competition. It's coming in with regulations shutting down what's left of our industry. I mean, it's a cold-blooded, systematic, military-style takeover. So, Chris, break down your new book, which I can't wait to read, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt.
Well, yeah, I mean, Alex, I think you nailed it. I mean, that's why we begin with Pine Ridge, because that's where it all began. And originally, those reservations were openly called prisoner of war camps. And you're right. They make self-sufficiency impossible and create this kind of culture of dependence, which destroys dignity, self-worth, community, with all of the attendant problems. That's why you have an estimated 80% alcoholism rate on Pine Ridge. And everywhere we went, whether it was Camden, whether it was southern West Virginia, where people are taking OxyContin, what they call hillbilly heroin, the sort of the drugs and the alcohol anesthetize people to the kind of pain and the suffering to which they have been reduced. And I think the reservation model is, in fact, one that we spent a lot of time reporting on and looking at for precisely that reason. When you reduce people to a level of desperation, it becomes far easier to control them. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, just all sorts of, just in the last few weeks, the refusal to restore unemployment benefits for hundreds of thousands of Americans, which means tens of thousands of these people will eventually lose their homes, a number now over 6 million. There's just Obamacare is another example. It's a corporate, essentially the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industries, $477 billion in subsidies. And then, of course, they can keep, as anyone such as myself knows who doesn't have a company plan, keep jacking up co-payments and premiums. And
I've got to interrupt. See, you're the only scholar out there on the so-called left, but you're just a human who wants freedom, who's honest that the insurance companies wrote it, and then the right wing gives Obama cover and goes, how dare you want to make us commies, when the whole thing was written to let corporations control the quality of care, make you buy their product, and jack up the price. I mean, it's such a fraud, but then you've got all the people on the left who, meanwhile, supporting it through ignorance.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you know, this is, I think, a very telling piece of legislation because it was written in the Heritage Foundation. It was first put into practice by Mitt Romney when he was governor in 2006 in Massachusetts, and then adopted by Barack Obama.
Incredible.
Obamacare is Obamacare. And that is a kind of window into the kind of false debates that go back and forth, because both of these two political parties, you know, are slavishly devoted to corporate interests. Obamacare is essentially forcing us to buy a defective corporate product, a for-profit product. It's staggering.
And what is the revolt angle of the book? Because, again, I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I'm going to order it today.
I think it's just this understanding that the formal mechanisms of power are not going to defend civil liberties or our interests or institute the kinds of reforms that will bring back the kind of egalitarian society that I think we all want. That now resistance has to come outside those formal mechanisms of power. That means acts of civil disobedience. I was arrested with Occupy protesters in front of Goldman Sachs. Going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the federal government. But I don't think we have any option left. And I'm not naive enough to even promise you that it will work. But I can tell you that the system is so corrupt. You know, you take New York City police and you look closely, most of the egregious assaults against protesters were carried out by the white-shirted officers who were earning about $110,000 a year. There was a lot of fraternization with the blue uniform police because these corporations hire them, like Goldman Sachs and Citibank, as rent-a-cops for private security for $37 an hour in their off time so they can you know, make some money.
Well, Goldman Sachs gave them, what was it? It was some giant amount of money the week before as a pure gift right to the police, a public bribe.
Yeah, J.P. Morgan, I think it was.
Yeah, J.P. Morgan. It was
right.
Like,
exactly. I mean, and I think, you know, when I covered the fall of East Germany, what happens is when the foot soldiers are no longer willing to defend the elite, you know, when Erich Honecker, the dictator in East Germany, sent down an elite paratroop division to Leipzig, where I was, and they wouldn't fire on the crowd, Honecker lasted another week in power. And I think that, you know, in fact, part of the reason I'm guessing that the NDAA was pushed through, I think, is because there's a kind of fear among these corporate oligarchs that the police won't protect them.
Well, that's one of my final questions here. I got a few to race through. I want to know what else is in the book, so people will definitely get it, because your ideas are, you know, right on from my own research, but so well laid out. That was my next issue. I'll guarantee you that if things continue to implode, the people they know that aren't going to shut up and go along are people like Chris Hedges, people like Alex Jones, people that they know are controlled by conscience, not because I'm some goody two-shoes, but because I don't want to live in a fascist state. I mean, I want my children to have a future. And they're really trying to set the precedent for this as they force people into a revolt, kind of arresting and, which they admit, scooping up people that they see as leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that once you create that legal mechanism that essentially permits or gives to the state that kind of power, then you're in really serious trouble. They use it on marginal elements within the society first, Muslims, black bloc anarchists, whatever, militia members, but you don't want to give them that kind of legal power. Which unfortunately we've already done, because they use the sort of fringe elements as a way to justify that kind of power, and then they turn it on the rest of us. That's exactly right, and history has just borne that out, you know, in conflict after conflict that I've covered and watched.
What about geopolitically? It seems like the world is kind of waking up to the fact that the United States has been seized by very evil forces.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I was quite an opponent of the invasion of Iraq on that issue, and I had been the Middle East bureau chief of the New York Times, because, you know, it was not only, you know, a tactical blunder, but probably one of the most strategic blunders we made, in essence, throwing the balance of power to Iran. Yeah, I think that, unfortunately, you know, we don't have a lot of friends left. Because of, I think, very misguided imperial projects that, again, of course, I mean, the war in Afghanistan, which, let's be frank, we're losing, there are a handful of corporations, Halliburton and Raytheon and on and on and on, that for whom they make money, as in all wars.
Could the Anglo-American establishment kind of stall and not have a Berlin Wall moment, but just kind of collapse like the Soviet Union?
I mean, that's the big question. I mean, collapse is coming. How does it come? Does it come gradually? Is there kind of a slow decline like the Ottoman Empire? Does it implode? These are questions that I ask all the time, but I don't have a definitive answer.
Well, I think they're going to try to go Hitler crazy and launch a bunch of wars that are so bad, everybody kind of lines up because we're in so much trouble. Well, yeah, the government's corrupt, but we're, fighting Russia and China now, so let's line up. We just lost 500,000 people. I mean, I think the elite are that crazy. And the way they're digging in, the way they're getting everything ready, looks like they're gearing up for World War III at a scale much bigger than the Cold War. The COG, the armored pillboxes, the weapons caching. Studying history, Chris, in closing, I'm not just trying to be a fearmonger here. I'm scared. I mean, I've studied history. I'm a history buff. And they're digging in for what looks like not just a war with the people, but a war with everybody else.
Well, that's, as Randolph Bourne said, in World War I, he said war is the health of the state, by which he meant that when the state declares war, you're right, everybody lines up behind it, in the name of patriotism and everything else, and it is a very effective measure, as it was in World War I, to essentially crush any form of dissent. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, history has shown that to be a very effective tactic for despotic states to channel energy and rage and mute internal dissent by creating an internal enemy and going after it. I don't put it past them.
Well, hopefully your book will wake people up. And